What's up, y'all? Welcome to Tabletop Bros. Today we're going to be painting up our brand new Skaventide terrain. First step, take it off the sprue. So this is the same terrain set that you're going to be using for either Skaventide or for Spearhead, and once you got it removed from the sprue, you definitely want to spend a little bit of time cleaning it up. So I like to take a dull razor blade and scrape off all of the areas where it was connected to the sprue. Once you get those mostly shaved down, you can go through and just kind of clean up the mold lines. I always like to spend a little bit of extra time prepping up my models before I paint them. The last thing you want to do is get to paint and then realize that there are visible mold lines. It's easy to just kind of trace around the side of the piece and find exactly where the mold lines are, and anywhere they're evident, you just want to make sure that they are cleaned up nice and flat. You could potentially do this after assembling stuff, but I like to do most of the cleanup ahead of time and then do a slight little cleanup afterwards. So I'm just going along each of the pieces and just kind of using my dull blade, or you could use a mold line remover to just gently scrape off the little bit of mold lines that are remaining after the sprue is cast. And then once I'm satisfied with that, it's time to move on to assembly. It's a pretty simple process. It does take a little bit of time and makes a little bit of a mess, but it's exponentially beneficial later on when it gets to painting, as the last thing you want to do is have some nicely painted models or terrain set with very evident mold lines, and I see it quite a bit. So now that we have all of the mold lines scraped, we're going to go ahead and do the basic little bit of assembly on this terrain. And the truth is, you don't actually have to use glue. It is push fit, but I do like to glue my pieces together anyway. Go ahead, give them a nice squeeze, and then once that is done, once the glue is dry, we just give it one more final scrape just to kind of get rid of some of the actual attachment lines between the two pieces. Again, you don't need to do this, but I find that it does make the final aesthetic just slightly more pleasing, so it's not as evident exactly where the two pieces are connected. So once we've got all that done, we're just going to have our basic 4 pieces assembled, and we're just going to start off with an initial base coat. Now in this case, I actually don't have the footage from base coating these models, but it's a pretty simple process. I essentially use like a zenithal highlight in gray, starting with a dark reaper, and then moving up to like a Mechanicum standard gray, and then finally just mixing in a little bit of white ink. Once I have everything zenithaled in gray, I went ahead through with a light brown and just kind of sprayed the bottom of it so it would blend in a little bit better with our tabletop and give it a sort of two-toned effect. The next step is to go through and just do some light airbrushing with like the glowing green effect. So essentially I just went to the Warpstone itself and the actual torches, hit them with a little bit of Tesseract Glow wherever there are illuminated pieces, and made sure to get a little bit of overspray onto some of the other pieces so it gives that full object source lighting effect, which is what OSL stands for. I also made sure to hit the various pieces of wood with brown as well. And then finally I went through with a couple of shades of gold, a little bit of silver, and some white to take care of all the metallics, the skulls, and the chains. And once you went through that little process right there, that gives us what we have here. This whole process from start to finish, including assembly and the airbrushing, as well as like the shading and everything that we're going to get into, took me about 4 hours in total to paint this set. So roughly like 1 hour per piece, which isn't bad. Next, we're going to move on to our washes. So I like these Citadel washes. I'm using the new ones in this video. These are pretty nice because they leave a little bit less of like the clouding effect that some of the previous washes from Games Workshop did. You could obviously use other brands if you have a favorite, but we're getting started with the Agrex Earthshade, and we're going to go over all of the various gold pieces on this project. Now we do have 2 different tones of gold, but we're going to use Agrex Earthshade on both those tones. It is important while you're going through this process that you do kind of get down in the cracks. The goal of the washes is to sort of eliminate that little area where 2 colors come together and then also shade down in the recesses, giving us more of like a detailed 3-dimensional effect. Now you're going to get some pooling as you go. Obviously, as gravity takes effect, everything is going to kind of move towards the bottom. So you just want to use your brush, dab up a little bit of that wash as it settles, but while it's still wet, and try to avoid any unnecessary or unsightly pooling. So we do take our time with this process as we have some nice colors already on here, and the less mistakes we make, the less corrections we have to make later. Now obviously this is a terrain set, so it doesn't need to be perfect, but we do still want it to look nice. And you'll start to see that as this process takes shape, immediately we see all of the gold starting to pop out. We see the recesses, especially in between colors, having that sort of black lining effect. And in this case, we're not so worried about getting the washes where we've already done a little bit of OSL, as essentially the areas down in the cracks where the washes collect are typically not going to be getting that lighting effect anyway. And again, as we continue through the process, we're just going to take our time. It's a rather soothing effect. Dab up any little excess pools of wash as we go. Want to make sure that once the washes start to dry that we don't touch them again with our brush or fingers or anything like that. as that's how you can get the kind of coffee staining effect where the wash has already started to dry and then you dab it away or touch it and then it leaves sort of like unsightly effects. So once we're done with the first piece, we can kind of see the effect that we have here, and then we're just going to go through and do the same effect on the other pieces. So we're going to be demonstrating on our lighter gold that we've used for this project. If you're curious about any of the paints that were used along the process or any of the tools, including the airbrush, all that stuff is listed down below in the description. Now I'm pretty good with an actual airbrush as I have a lot of experience, but realistically you can achieve most of these effects with minimal effort and minimal skill. When it comes to the actual brushwork and the washing and everything, I try to be as careful as possible. Sometimes we're going to have little areas where we make mistakes, but again, this is a terrain project, so it doesn't need to be perfect. We do want to make sure that we go along all of the various edges, we get lots of wash down in the recesses, and when we're done, each of the pieces will start looking real nice. So obviously each of these pieces is different from the last, so there's a little bit of technique that goes into each one of them. But again, the most important thing is just making sure that we get lots of wash down in the recesses, avoid too much excess pooling, clean up any mistakes we make as we go. But in the end, we can kind of see the contrast between the darker golds and the lighter golds, the washed areas and unwashed areas. And once we're done with the Agrex Earthshade effect, we're just going to move on to our next color. So the next shade we're going to be using for this process is Null Oil. And for the Null Oil, that's basically just a black wash. We're just going to be going over all of our silver bits. In this case, we've used Leadbelcher to do all of the silver bits on this project. And again, we're just going to take our time. We want to make sure that any areas we've already washed or shaded are already dry. So in this case, because we have 4 different pieces, we just keep our order from the first piece to the last piece. And that way, by the time the 4th piece is done, the first piece is dry and we move on through the process. So once we have all of the silver wash, and again, just making sure to get it down in the cracks in between areas to kind of clean up any of those imperfections from when we were airbrushing or hand painting, we're going to end up with a nice effect seen here. The next step, we're going to be using a contrast paint. This one is Skeleton Horde, and we're just going to be going through all of the various skulls and bones. And again, we're going to treat this contrast paint the same way that we treat a wash. It's going to leave very little bits of color, sort of a tinting effect on the exposed surfaces, and then it's going to seep down in the cracks and give us that same outline that the washes give us. I personally love Skeleton Horde. It's one of my favorite and most used contrast paints, as it does give a really nice effect specifically for bones, hence the name Skeleton Horde. And we can see when we're going over the actual skeleton just how much extra depth it adds. Later on, you can always come back through and do a light little dry brush over it, or if you'd rather do some like hand painted highlights, we can bring back out a little bit of that pop, especially towards like the upward facing surfaces. The same effect that we get with the zenithal highlight, but using a brush instead. So once we've got all of that done, we're going to move on to Wildwood. So obviously this terrain is very much Stormcast themed, but like the Skaven have taken over. So we do already have the wood done with the airbrush, but we're going to go back through with the Wildwood and give it a real dark tint to it. All of the dark wood that Skaven has used to kind of like modify the existing Stormcast pieces, we're going to be doing with this Wildwood. This again is a contrast paint. And because we're starting with a darker undertone, we're not going to get as much of like the actual contrast effect, as the raised areas are still going to be tinted pretty dark using this. You could potentially use a lighter color for the wood here if you prefer, but I wanted specifically to have all of the wood that the Skaven used be a little bit darker and all of the existing Stormcast wood to kind of have a little bit of like the lighter effect. So again, with this contrast paint, we're going to make sure that it doesn't pool up too heavy. We want to get a nice coat over everything as we go, being careful not to get any like overbrushing or anything onto like our existing painted stuff, as when it comes to like these final steps, the less mistakes we make, the less corrections we need to make, and the better overall final product we're going to have. So just going through here and picking out all the pieces of wood, there is a lot of random pieces throughout, and because we're getting towards like the end of our painting, we want to be extra careful not to make any mistakes. If you do make mistakes, it's easy to just pick up some of the previous colors and just kind of touch those up. But for the most part, we do this flawlessly and make sure not to make any mistakes so we don't have to do any touch-ups later on, which in this case, I didn't actually do any in this entire project. So now we can really start to see that our wood, gold, steel, and OSL are really coming together. We've specifically went through on this big piece and done all of the like boarded up pieces, but left the like existing Stormcast door and wood that's on the piece without the Wildwood. to give an extra little bit of contrast. Now we're going to be moving on to our Warpstone Glow, and we're going to be going through and just going over some of the pieces that we put the previous OSL effect on. Again, this is a contrast paint from Games Workshop, designed specifically to sink down in the cracks and just leave a lighter tint over everything you touch with it. Certain areas we're not going to put any of the Warpstone Glow on. Other areas we're going to completely coat it. It's all about just how much of the bright under effect you want to leave evident. Here I've done a little bit of like a panel lining with the Warpstone Glow around some of like the Skaven ruins, as I didn't want them to be quite as bright. Now we're going to be demonstrating the Warpstone Glow specifically on the actual pieces of Warpstone. So I'm going around like the various edges where they connect. I'm dabbing little bits down in the various little recesses of the actual Warpstone itself. And as it dries, the gravity and the pigment in the contrast paint is going to take effect, allow some of the darker pigment to sink down into the recesses, also being affected by gravity. And that's going to give us a much more like detailed final effect. Once we finish up with that, we're going to end up with the results as seen. And for the most part, our project is done. Now we can obviously go back through and do some highlights. We can do some touch-ups as necessary. But overall, I'm very happy with this terrain. It only took about 4 hours to complete the entire set. It is super detailed. The final result is very good looking in my opinion. Definitely ready for our tabletop games. And as we get ready to launch off our Age of Sigmar Escalation League, we've got some nice new thematic pieces of terrain to play our games with. Let me know what you think of the process down below. If you'd like to see in the future some of the airbrushing or base coating videos, I'd be glad to provide some of them as well. And hopefully by now, Tabletop Bros has earned your subscription. I'm really happy with how this terrain came out. I really like how this stuff looks. The combination of like the cool Stormcast ruins and buildings with like the degeneracy of like the Skaven modifications is super cool. And I'm definitely looking forward to doing some conversions with this in the future, creating some custom pieces. And if you're interested in seeing something like that, make sure to like and subscribe. So yeah, that's it for our Skaventide terrain set painting video. Let me know what you think of the techniques down below. If you'd like to see some future content with some terrain stuff like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so if you're interested in the Age of Sigmar Escalation League. But in the meantime, that's it from the Tabletop Bros. Later!